All right, my AP language friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And up my sleeve today, I have FRQ1 2024 set to the infamous food truck paper. And what we'll do is kind of stick to status quo if you're familiar with my work. I'll walk you through how my students tackled the introductory paragraph using one of two heuristics. Sometimes they're known as frames, the inverted or the declarative method. Body paragraphs, we will proceed through an Aristotelian heuristic known as the syllogistic method. And for good measure, we'll throw a conclusion paragraph on the end. So at the end of the video, you'll see how my students paint the entire essay. Before we proceed further, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Spread the word far and wide. Let your friends, colleagues, and students know about this channel so that you can help me beat that pesky algorithm. So slides are down below. Everything that you see forthcoming is nicely down there in a Google slide. It's yours for the taking. 'Tis free. So here's the prompt. Mobile food service establishments such as food trucks and food carts have become increasingly trendy in recent years, offering customers appealing and often innovative dining options out of vehicles that can easily be located near workplaces and leisure activities. These businesses have sometimes been held back from expanding because of local regulations that restrict their activities and require operators to obtain licenses and certifications. Proponents of these regulations say that laws are needed to ensure that meals offered by mobile food services are safe. And that's interesting because none of the sources really talk about that. And we'll mention this and develop this idea a little further in just a second. I like it when my students say something original and outside of the text. And the College Board gave us a nice little bone there for this, a possible angle that we can go so that we have an original thesis, an original argument, and that these businesses do not have an unfair advantage over traditional restaurants. That's covered a lot in the sources. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources, and here's the kicker, develops your position on what are the most important factors for cities to consider when regulating mobile food service establishments. So again, just to piggyback upon what I was just saying, I like it when my students say something original or take an idea from one of the sources and develop it into an authentic original thesis statement. And this prompt lends itself beautifully to that. And in the exemplars that you'll see in just a second, you'll see how a couple of my students did that. So the question becomes, so how do I write the introductory paragraph? As I've said, you got to Bob Ross this a lot. So at the time of recording, we're in early February, and my students have practiced my heuristics or my frames a lot. So I know some teachers are going to look at these exemplars and say, my kids can never do that. Oh, you can, you can, you can. So I get to the proverbial easel and canvas and paint with and for my students a lot. My students have seen me over the course of months paint so many exemplars for them right before their eyes. And what happens is it demystifies the process. But second to that, Bob Ross used a heuristic known as the wet on wet technique every time he tackled a natural landscape. And every time we do an FRQ for AP language, we're using the same frames and we're using the same heuristics. So what we do here in synthesis, we also do in rhetorical analysis and argument. And my students come to me as 10 H'ers, 10 honors, which is our pre-AP. So they're hearing a consistent message with regard to composition. They follow me to AP Lang, and then when we get to Lit, we're also using the exact same frames. So my students really grow and mature nicely as writers because everything has a uniform approach. So the declarative thesis heuristic is going to look like this. You can begin with the thesis. So you talk about those regulations that cities have to take, and you just drop it. Context and background I'm going to refer to this later on as the GPS. Students need to set their coordinates for the essay with the context in the background. And just for some further elaboration, my students write 4 paragraphs on all of the FRQs, Lang and Lit. So I like them to set their directionality in the intro for body paragraph 1 and body paragraph number 2. We'll model that in just a second. I also run intensive word study academies throughout the academic year to help my students augment their vocab. And by tier 2, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. So it is an academic paper, so I do want to see some tier 2. I also run a nuance academy in which we study Strunk and White's Write It Right. And in particular, their concept of rule number 18 that espouses the ideas that there's 12 different sentence types that can be patterned 20 different ways. So pay attention to how my students try to achieve voice rhythm and flow by staggering and varying their sentence constructs. And then the intro, just like the essay, has the magic number 4. We're going for 4 sentences. You can flip that and start by setting the coordinates for the GPS, the context and background, and end with the thesis. And I'll give you examples for both. And then tier 2 sentence constructs, 4 sentences. That stays staple. So let's unpack that because we're just talking into the ether here. And the big thing I tell my students is this: know your direction. You have to know where those body paragraphs are going before you place pen to paper, and hint at where body paragraph 1 and body paragraph number 2 are going. And then just to harken back to what I was saying earlier, it's a good idea to have an original thesis because the prompt says your argument must be central. The old exam used to say that all the time. And I still want students to have an authentic thesis statement. So you're going to see them get out of the box a little bit from the sources. So here's exemplar number 1. I'll read it top to bottom and then I'll unpack it for you. Concerning the recent upward trend in mobile food service establishments, the scenario boils down to an old sports adage: win or lose, do it fairly. As such, regulations need to consider how current regulations weigh the balance of either favoring or disadvantaging existing brick and mortar establishments. So that's body paragraph number 1. While helping the small guy is a noble pursuit, it should not come at the expense of the top dogs who are playing by an entirely different set of rules. When placed in the fulcrum of such considerations, regulatory policies need to meet both parties in the middle. So we're kind of riding the fence here a little bit and doing, because they can say yes, no, maybe. So we got kind of a qualifier going on here. Meet both parties in the middle. That way it will be a win-win situation for all involved. So the big thing is, the directionality has to be manifest, and it is in this. All right. The other thing that we want to pay attention to are tier 2 level words, and this one's really good. I don't like the second sentence in the sense that regulations is said twice. And then later on, they start talking about regulatory policies. So some synonyms would be nice to get rid of that redundancy. But you can see that all of the sentence constructs are different. I really like the first sentence and the use of that colon. So through the Nuance Academy, my students are really well versed in how to use colons, semicolons, dashes, ellipses, parentheticals, and all of that good stuff. And the rule of thumb I give them is this: pay attention to what you drop in sentence number 1. Don't replicate it in number 2. When you get to sentence 3, don't replicate 2. And then when you get to 4, don't replicate 3. That's a simple rule to help achieve voice rhythm and flow. So this one clearly has a thesis statement, quite manifest, and this one's pretty solid from top to bottom. Let's paint one more just to see it. So I'll show you 3 in total. Again, it's important for students to know their direction before they set sail. So set the coordinates in that GPS. Think outside of the box. Let's go. It has been said that tact is the ability to step on a man's toes without messing up the shine of his shoes. And when concerning the regulatory strategies regarding the recent uptick in mobile food establishments, this should be the predominant mode of thinking while policymakers hem and haw about the issue of fairness. The fact of the matter is this: brick and mortar establishments carefully and strategically choose their location to maximize profit. Allowing squatters, food trucks, and food carts onto this pre established turf unquestionably sullies a man's shoes. And I like the analogy here of the shoes, right? I think that's pretty cool. So when you begin with a hook or an analogy, it always bodes well if it's pulled off well. And the other thing in this too, in terms of directionality, is that, these brick and mortar establishments carefully scope out their territory and say, we can maximize profit if we have this establishment. And when you have food trucks and food carts pulling up and setting dock right in your front yard, it disadvantages the brick and mortar establishments. So both paragraphs are going to look at those variables in terms of directionality for paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. And I'll show you those paragraphs in just a second. I really love the voice, the rhythm, the flow in this. The use of the parenthetical statement in the fourth sentence is nice. You see this kid using a colon, just like example number 1. And it has a nice ease and a certain alacrity to it that students that over rely on independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences, they tend to yield that dot, 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 dot rhythm and flow. And this student does a nice job of avoiding that. All right, you can do this, my friends. It's easy peasy. It just takes a little bit of practice. Winners make the effort while losers make excuses. In the case of making fair regulatory policies for mobile food services, this concept could not be further from the truth. The fact of the matter is this: food trucks and food carts want to masquerade as brick and mortar establishments, but it's a case of a little brother trying to wear the bigger britches of an older sibling. Policy, therefore, needs to carefully consider what is fair and just for two wildly disparate entities, right? So both paragraphs are going to go in that direction. And you can see here clearly we were working on colons at the time of writing our introductions, because all three of them did that, right? So we were working on sentence pattern number 14 in Strunk and White. That was our pattern of the day. And my students did a nice job of introducing that into their introductions. You can also see here in all three examples, the tier 2 vocabulary fits the mouth of the student. They're not using $1 million words and thinking, oh, geez, I'm doing brilliant writing, right? So sometimes we got to disabuse our students of that notion that if they use big words, that somehow they're, being fancy and sounding really smart. So it's not the case. So it's got to fit the mouth. So give it a whirl, pause here, and have your students try an introductory paragraph, either declaring or inverting the thesis. And then a good practice is this. Usually after I Bob Ross it 3 times myself, so I'll show students 3 exemplars that I wrote, I like to take a look at some student samples, put them on the overhead, break them down, and then get into some pure revision, and we can get into the nuts and bolts of that introduction and tweak them around a little bit. So very good practice. I'm a firm believer that the more writing students see, the better they become. The big thing that I like to do during that exercise is have students, when their exemplar is up on the board, state their directionality, because that's kind of a hard concept for some students to grasp, is setting that GPS before you set sail. So the question becomes, so how do I write the body paragraphs? And I've alluded to this. You're going to proceed syllogistically. So this is an Aristotelian heuristic, comes from Aristotle, and he ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they'd throw out these pithy, juicy, essential questions like, what is justice? And some of you are familiar with that in the seminal text, Plato's Republic. And Aristotle, like composition teachers, was principally concerned with line of reasoning. So he made this heuristic. It's very mathematical, very computative. He made this heuristic to help students sustain a cogent line of reason. And that was his word, cogency. So if we argue from premise to conclusion and keep everything consistent, we should be good. So let me give you an example. Arsenic is deadly. If I come out and say that, you're all going to nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, you are correct. But if I follow it up with some textual support in the second premise that goes like this, you're going to draw a natural conclusion. So if I say, this morning I woke up to make a cup of coffee, stepped into the kitchen, and there's Skipper underneath the kitchen sink, and I say, Skipper, and he pulls out his muzzle and his grizzle. It's all covered with white stuff, and I'm like, no, I put arsenic underneath the kitchen sink because I have a rat infestation problem. You naturally are going to conclude, oh, that's not going to bode well for Skipper. Skipper's going to die. Morbid example, but it resonates with kids. So how do we morph that heuristic and turn it into something for writing purposes? The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. And there's some math involved in this. I want that first premise to be 3 sentences long, and here's the reason why. The argument must stay central. So if in sentences 1, 2, and 3, the students are piggybacking the sources, they're really not doing argumentative synthesis. They're doing plot synopsis. They're regurgitating the sources, and they don't have an authentic thesis that they're wielding. So 3 sentences is kind of a safeguard. By why reason, this is what I mean, and I'll model this in just a second. Up top in the thesis, we don't get into the whys. We're just dropping down our position with regards to the thesis. So like yes regulations, no regulations, qualify regulations. Now we got to get into the why. Starting in the 4th sentence, we're going to drop our textual support, and this is where we're going to have a teeter-totter blend of quoting and paraphrasing. And again, you'll see in my exemplars, I like it when students use at least 3 direct quotes. All right, again, so first premise 3, second premise 3, just to keep the math consistent. And then the conclusion of the body paragraph, and I really want to hearken that. Body paragraphs need to be concluded. We got to throw everything back to the prompt and the thesis. And one little piece of math, one left. This is going to take about 10 to 12 sentences. So those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers, they don't hack it. And there's just not enough support and analysis in there. So to give students plenty of opportunity to support and defend their thesis, I think 10 to 12 sentences is good turf. So question becomes, how do I write the first premise? You can use a stem, and I do this early in the year where we say things like there is a clear reason why, or there are a couple of reasons why. And ultimately, we want students to articulate a why reason. And if they say reason why, by default, they're going to articulate the reason why. So here's an example that I wrote. There's one principal reason why all these cities should restrict mobile food establishments. They are closely akin to squatters. And that's an original thesis right there. None of the sources talk about that. If such a service plops itself down on the turf of an already rooted restaurant, that is not fair. As such, all that is needed is a radius rule that sets up a reasonable boundary that does not unfairly favor the underdog. So that takes 3 sentences. We talk about the promise of the first premise. And now all the quotes and or paraphrases need to be talking specifically about that squatting policy and how it disfavors favors the underdog, disfavors the brick and mortar establishments, right? So just to recap that, first premise, 3 sentences, argue a why reason. And then the first premise is a promise, and it predicates the quotes and paraphrases that must be established. So let's see a first premise again and kick those training wheels off. So this is going to be the first premise that's going to anchor the whole body paragraph. And basically, we're going to say the same thing. as the one with the stem, but take the training wheels off. Imagine if someone all of a sudden decided to build a squatter's camp in your front yard. Not only is this illegal, but no one has the right to live rent-free on someone else's property. And this is the analogous scenario in the mobile food service debate. These trucks and carts are nothing more and nothing less than squatters. Ooh, do I like this? Let's talk about something real quick. Hypotheticals. I don't think this gets taught a lot when we teach kids synthesis. Hypothetically, think outside of the box a little bit. What do the texts hint at but not directly say? What's the pregnant silence? And then hypothesize around that. And I think some of the sources do hint at, well, this is kind of like squatters' rights, and it's not fair to the brick and mortar establishments. So, what we have to do is go get our quotes and our paraphrases that align with that concept of squatting and the rules and regulations surrounding that. So, you go quote hunting. Make sure it's all aligned, and that should keep your line of reasoning intact, all right? And that's going to constitute the second premise, the support and the analysis. So this is the fourth sentence. And again, I tell my students to hold off on the quotes and paraphrases until the fourth sentence. So this is the beginning of the second premise. Take as a perfect case in point the city of New Orleans, where there are at present no proximity restrictions from restaurants for food trucks, source B. Now, in order to get the quotes to talk and get them conversational, I use something called the 5-word rule. I place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote relatively small. And that should give it that chit-chatty sort of feel. We quote, we gotta analyze it. So look at how we unpack that quote. So imagine that Italian restaurant, an establishment that was carefully selected to optimize business, pays rent, pays taxes, expends a lot of money in advertisement, contributes financially and aesthetically to the neighborhood, all of a sudden has a spaghetti and meatball food truck roll up on its front curve. All right, I love the hypothetical here. This is really cool. And then you're going to tie in the sources to this. Not only does this disadvantage an organization that is playing with stern and fixed rules, but it is not right. Baltimore County is moving in the right direction in that they have enacted a buffer law that doesn't allow food trucks to park within 200 feet of restaurants, source D. So you see how source B and source D are holding hands? They're talking to each other. This is what I mean by getting the sources to communicate with each other, right? So whenever you quote, you got to analyze. Well, this is not a perfect solution. It is a step in the right direction. Brian McComas, president of the Federal Hill Hospitality Association, is in accord, and I love that, little stems like that, is in accord with me, right? So someone is espousing your argument. You're not stealing their argument. They are agreeing with you. So is in accord and recognizing that it comes down to the commitment that brick and mortar restaurants make to the neighborhood in which they are rooted and the price they pay to do business there, source D. All right, now we're going to conclude this. So we have 3 sources. Again, I want 3 sentences for the first premise, 3 sources in the second premise. The bottom line is this: money is the transaction that leads to possession. These establishments have sole proprietary rights to run unfettered businesses without the small guys of the restaurant industry squatting rent-free. So you go back to that notion of squatting. It comes full circle. Syllogisms are circles. While buffer laws are not a perfect solution, they are a band-aid to address what is otherwise a gross inequity. And again, usually those conclusions take about 2 or 3 sentences. So you can see there, the line of reasoning stays perfectly intact, right? Because the first premise predicates the quote selection. And then all that compositional stuff, a sentence constructs, tier 2 level vocabulary, carries over from the introduction into the body paragraphs. So that's perfectly executed. Question becomes, what do I do next? You bust out another syllogism because the essay is 4 paragraphs. And again, this is the beauty of using heuristics and frames. It takes the guesswork out of the equation. Students will intuitively, instinctually know what to do with practice, which is perfect for a timed writing exam because we don't want them second guessing their compositional moves. Usually in this second body paragraph, I like to add some concessions and rebuttals just to get that checked off. And I'll give you an example of the first premise and then the quotes we would use for it. While one can concede that establishing a viable mobile food service can catapult the underdog into an actual brick and mortar location, there's a gaping logical fallacy in this line of thinking. So take a look at some of the sources, right? I don't remember the number exactly, but they're making the argument that these food carts and food trucks get established with the hopes that they can sock enough money away to buy a brick and mortar. While that seems noble and like great, this student's taking the angle of, well, that's really unfair and it's not a level playing field. To draw an analogy, renters are not allowed to steal from homeowners in the hopes of one day purchasing their dream home. And this is the parallel scenario. If policies do not forbid what is closely akin to squatting, living rent-free on someone else's territory, then restaurant owners are being completely disincentivized to run their businesses. All right, so you got to keep the promise of the first premise. What quotes and or paraphrases must you use, right? It was source F that I was mentioning earlier. This one quote has to go in there. So look at it. One of the most compelling aspects of food trucks is their ability to act as an incubator for entrepreneurs to start a viable cash flow positive business that they can grow into a brick and mortar establishment to become a more stable part of the community. That's the best quote there, right? And this is a cool conversation to have with kids. What's the best quote? So maybe you take that first premise there and do a little exercise with students where you say, get into the sources and come up to the whiteboard, come up to the corkboard and write down the best quotes and or paraphrases. The comic also works well for this particular first premise if they deconstruct the logos of it. And then this last quote here from source A. It is far easier to secure startup capital for a cart than a restaurant. And then here's the thing, right, of thinking out of the box. How about we have regulations that make it easier to open a restaurant, and then you mitigate the food truck scenario, right? So make it easier to get loans for these small guys that want to open up actual restaurants. And that's something the sources don't talk about, and it's perfectly good to think outside of the box. So if you want to, you and your students can write the rest of that syllogism and piece it together so that you practice. But we got to talk about conclusion stems for the final paragraph of the essay, that pesky conclusion paragraph. Let's wrap the essay up. I like to use stems. The conclusion paragraph, I think, is akin to the grand finale of a fireworks display. So you got to say something all-encompassing, all-encapsulating. So stems like simply said, evidentially, in no other words when it's all said and done at the end of the day work well for that. Here's an example, and it's just going to take 3 or 4 sentences. Simply put, proximity restrictions and zoning regulations, while a step in the right direction, do not do enough to protect the rights of brick and mortar establishments. While mobile food service establishments certainly have every right to compete, doing so in the front yard of business owners is not fair or just. As such, what must be regulated are the acceptable locations for these entrepreneurs to set up shop. And that would take you through the entire essay for this. All right, super cool. Happy teaching, happy writing. Note that if you need to reach out to me for any reason, you can drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I love the collaborative aspect of these Facebook groups and the YouTube channel. I have a lot of teachers and students reach out to me with questions. I always respond, so don't hesitate to throw me a line if you want to, and I'm even happy to communicate with your classroom if you want. So I do that quite often. Note that this summer I'm teamed up with Applied Practice, the good folks at Applied Practice, and we're going to offer summer PD sessions for AP Language and AP Lit. So I've been teaching both courses for over 2 decades. And what we're going to do is meet 5 times at 90 minutes apiece and go over all the FRQs, my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, and unpack further how we can use these heuristics and frames to write uniformly across all of the FRQs. So dates and times and cost, you can find all that information at Applied Practice's website, www.appliedpractice.com. They're also awarding certificates for completion hours and all of that good stuff. So if you're in need of that, you can check out their website or drop me an email. So I'm going to have exercises and writing workshops for all the exams from 2015 to the present that I'll put up in my YouTube channel as we head into test prep season. So keep abreast of the channel, subscribe, and you'll get updates whenever I upload anything. Take care and be well.